The room was built for power, not comfort. Dark walnut walls absorbed sound. The long table gleamed beneath low golden light, and every man seated around it understood that what was said here never left these walls. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and noise, but inside, everything was controlled, measured, precise, just like the man at the head of the table. Dante Morty didn't raise his voice to command attention. He didn't need to. Silence followed him the way shadows followed light. His fingers rested loosely against a crystal glass, untouched whiskey catching reflections of the room as he listened to one of his captains outline a territorial dispute near the docks. Numbers were being discussed. Routes, percentages, consequences. Dante's expression didn't change. 3 months ago, he had signed away a marriage with that same calm indifference. No hesitation, no visible regret. Elena Morty had become Elena Rossi again with a single stroke of his pen, her life severed from his like a clean surgical cut. It had been necessary, efficient, final. At least, that's what he had told himself. "We move the shipments through the southern channel," the captain was saying, voice tight with caution. "Less risk, but we lose." A sharp vibration cut through the room. Every head turned. Dante's phone, placed neatly beside his glass, buzzed once against the polished wood. It didn't ring often during meetings. It wasn't allowed to. The rules were clear. Only one person in his entire organization had permission to break that rule. Marco. Dante didn't reach for it immediately. He let it vibrate once more, his gaze still fixed on the man speaking, as if nothing had interrupted them. The captain faltered under that stare, words slowing, then stopping completely. Silence settled. Only then did Dante pick up the phone. He didn't excuse himself, didn't explain. He simply answered, bringing it to his ear with the same controlled precision he applied to everything in his life. "Yes." Marco didn't speak right away. That more than anything shifted something in the air. Marco never hesitated, not like this. "Boss," his voice came low, roughened in a way Dante had never heard before. Dante's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the phone. "We found her." The words landed without context, without explanation, but they struck something deep and buried. Something Dante had sealed away with documents and signatures, and a decision he had never allowed himself to question. His gaze dropped, unfocused now, no longer seeing the men in front of him. "Your ex-wife," Marco continued, and for a fraction of a second Dante's chest felt like it had been hollowed out. "She's pregnant, 4 months." The world didn't tilt, it didn't shatter. It simply stopped. Dante didn't breathe. 4 months. The number echoed, precise and merciless, a timeline he could calculate without effort, a memory he had buried rising uninvited, the last night, the one mistake, the one moment of weakness before everything had ended. He had left before dawn, papers had followed by afternoon. Clean, controlled, final. And she's unconscious. That was when something broke. It wasn't visible, not to the men watching him, not to anyone who didn't know him well enough to recognize the fracture in stillness, but inside, something snapped with a quiet, devastating finality. Dante stood. The chair scraped sharply against the floor, the sound cutting through the room like a blade. No one spoke, no one dared. He didn't ask where, didn't ask how. Marco wouldn't have called if it wasn't already handled. "Location," Dante said. An address followed, a neighborhood Dante knew without needing to think, not somewhere she should have been, not somewhere she would have chosen. Not somewhere safe. His mind moved fast, dissecting, calculating, but the pieces didn't fit. Elena had been taken care of, he had made sure of it, the settlement, the arrangements, the distance. Everything had been handled. So why? Why was she alone? Why was she unconscious? Why didn't he know? "Boss," Marco's voice pressed, urgency creeping in now. "We need to move." Dante ended the call without another word. The room remained frozen, every man watching as he reached for his jacket, movements precise, controlled, but something had changed. Something in the way his shoulders held tension, in the way his jaw locked just a fraction too tight. "Meeting S over," he said. That was it, no explanation, no delegation, no instructions. Unheard of. One of the older men shifted slightly. "Dante, the docks." "Handle it." The tone wasn't raised, but it carried weight. Finality, a warning. No one spoke again. Dante walked out. Not quickly, not rushed, but with a purpose that radiated off him like heat, each step deliberate as he moved through the corridor, past guards who straightened instinctively, past doors that opened before he reached them. The elevator ride was too slow. Every second stretched, filled with images he couldn't stop. Alina as she had been. Alina walking out of his penthouse with nothing but a suitcase. Alina turning once, just once, like she expected him to stop her. He hadn't. He had let her go because it was safer. Because distance meant protection. Because love was a liability he couldn't afford. 4 months. The doors opened. Cold night air hit him as he stepped outside. The city loud again, alive again, but it felt distant, irrelevant. A car was already waiting. Marco had anticipated him. Dante slid into the back seat, the door closing with a heavy, final sound. The engine roared to life instantly, tires biting into the pavement as they pulled into traffic. He stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing a woman lying unconscious somewhere in the dark, carrying his child. And for the first time in years, Dante Morty didn't feel in control. He felt something far more dangerous. Fear. The night had teeth, sharp and unforgiving, the kind that sank into bone and stayed there, gnawing quietly beneath the skin. Alina Rossi felt them long before her body finally gave out, long before her knees hit the pavement with a force that sent a dull shock up her spine. The city didn't stop for her. It never did. Cars passed, headlights slicing through the darkness. People moved in blurred shadows, footsteps echoing past like she was nothing more than another piece of forgotten debris in a place that specialized in forgetting. She pressed her palm instinctively against her stomach, fingers trembling as if she could shield what mattered most from a world that had already taken everything else. 4 months. The number repeated in her mind like a quiet, fragile promise she was terrified of breaking. She hadn't meant for it to happen like this. She hadn't meant for anything to unravel the way it had, but life didn't ask for permission before it collapsed. It simply did. She had tried. God, she had tried harder than she thought a person could. The memory of the penthouse still haunted her in strange, disjointed flashes, the polished marble floors, the soft hum of silence that came with too much space, the scent of expensive cologne that clung to everything Dante touched. That life had felt permanent once, like something she had stepped into and would never have to question again. She had believed in it with a kind of quiet certainty that now felt almost naive. The divorce had come like a blade, clean and cold, severing everything in a way that left no room for negotiation or understanding. Papers delivered without explanation, signatures demanded without conversation, a life dismantled in the span of a few hours. She had stood there holding the envelope, her name already stripped back to something smaller, something less, and waited for the call that never came. She had called instead, again and again. His office, his phone, the restaurant. The numbers she knew by heart. Each time she was turned away, dismissed by men who spoke like they had been given clear instructions not to let her through, not to let her reach him, not to let her exist in his world anymore. At first she had thought it was pride, then anger, then confusion. By the time the truth settled in, heavy and suffocating, it had already been too late. The money she had received barely lasted a month in a city that devoured savings without mercy. Rent swallowed most of it, leaving scraps for food, for transport, for the bare minimum required to survive. She had sold what little she had left, jewelry first, then clothes, then anything that could be exchanged for a few more days of breathing space. Each transaction felt like shedding pieces of a life she no longer recognized. The hardest part wasn't the loss of luxury. It was the loss of safety, the quiet certainty that no matter what happened, she would be okay. That illusion had died the moment she realized she was alone, truly alone, carrying a child she hadn't planned, hadn't prepared for, but couldn't bring herself to regret. The dizziness had started weeks ago, subtle at first, easy to ignore. She had blamed it on stress, on exhaustion, on the endless cycle of work and worry that left her running on fumes. The diner shifts were long, unforgiving, and her manager's patience wore thinner with every moment she had to pause, every time her body reminded her that it was no longer just hers. "We can't afford weak links," he had said, his voice flat, dismissive, as if her condition was an inconvenience rather than a reality. Hours disappearing faster than it came in. Food became optional, something she rationed, something she pushed aside when the numbers didn't add up. The baby needed nutrients. The baby needed care. The baby needed a mother who wasn't constantly calculating whether she could afford to eat or save the money for something more important. But the math never worked in her favor. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Half a sandwich someone had left behind, stale and forgotten, but it had been enough to keep her going a little longer. Not enough, though. Never enough. Her vision blurred as she tried to stand, the world tilting at an angle that made no sense, streetlights stretching into long, distorted streaks of gold. She reached for the edge of a nearby bench, fingers scraping against cold metal, but her grip slipped. Her body followed. The impact with the ground was distant, muffled, like it was happening to someone else. Sound faded next, the city's constant noise dissolving into a dull hum that echoed somewhere far away. She became aware of her breathing, shallow and uneven, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a quiet surrender. For a moment she thought of him, not the man he had been at the end, cold and distant, but the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had looked at her like she was something rare, something worth protecting. It was a dangerous thought, one she usually avoided, but in that moment, as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, it felt unavoidable. Dant. The name slipped from her lips, barely a whisper, more breath than sound, but it carried everything she hadn't said, everything she had buried under layers of hurt and silence. Her hand tightened over her stomach. "I'm trying," she murmured weakly, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to the life growing inside her. "I'm really trying." The words broke apart as her strength gave out, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had been fighting for weeks. The cold seeped into her bones as she lay there, unmoving, the world dimming to black. The last thing she felt was a faint flutter beneath her palm, a small, fragile reminder that she wasn't alone, even as everything around her disappeared. The car didn't slow when it turned into the narrow street. It sliced through the darkness with a quiet, controlled aggression, headlights sweeping over cracked pavement and shuttered storefronts that looked like they had long since given up pretending to belong to a living city. Dante didn't speak from the back seat. He didn't need to. The tension in the air was command enough, thick and suffocating, coiling around every man inside the vehicle like a warning that something had shifted in a way none of them fully understood yet. Marco sat in the front, jaw tight, eyes scanning every shadow as if expecting the night itself to fight back. "Up ahead," he said finally, voice low, careful, as if raising it might shatter whatever fragile thread still held the situation together. "Left side, near the bus stop." The car eased to a stop, but Dante was already moving before it fully settled, the door opening with a sharp, decisive motion that broke the stillness of the street like a gunshot. Cold air hit him, sharp enough to sting, but he barely registered it. His focus had narrowed to a single point, a shape on the ground that shouldn't have been there, that didn't belong in a place like this, in a life like this. For a fraction of a second, his mind rejected what he was seeing, tried to reshape it into something that made sense, something that fit the narrative he had constructed for the past 3 months. She was supposed to be safe, comfortable. Distant, yes, but protected by the very systems he had built to ensure nothing touched what was his. That had been the logic. That had been the justification. It unraveled the moment he reached her. Elena. Her name came out quieter than expected, almost swallowed by the night, but it carried something raw, something unguarded that didn't belong to the man people feared. She didn't respond. Of course she didn't. Her body lay curled slightly on the cold concrete, one hand still pressed protectively over her stomach, as if even unconscious, some instinct remained that refused to let go. Dante dropped to his knees beside her without hesitation, his coat brushing against dirt and gravel, something he would have noticed once, something that would have mattered once. It didn't now. Nothing did except the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest and the unnatural pallor of her skin under the streetlight's harsh glow. "Cristo?" The word slipped from him before he could stop it, a breath more than a sound, carrying disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. His hand hovered for a second before settling against her cheek, the contact immediate and jarring. She was cold. Not the kind of cold that came from weather, but something deeper, something that spoke of neglect, of time spent without the basic things a human body needed to survive. His fingers moved instinctively, brushing strands of hair away from her face, tracing the hollow beneath her cheekbone that hadn't been there before. Too thin, too fragile. The image clashed violently with every memory he had of her, every version of her that had existed in his mind since the day he had walked away. "Boss?" Marco's voice came from somewhere behind him, cautious, measured. "We need to move. She's been out here too long." Dante didn't respond immediately. His attention had shifted, drawn to the subtle curve beneath Alina's oversized sweater, something that had been hidden from him until now, something that redefined everything in an instant. 4 months. The number hit harder this time, not as an abstract concept, but as something real, something tangible lying beneath his hand when it moved, almost involuntarily, to rest over hers. There was life there. His life. A truth that had existed without his knowledge, without his protection, without his permission. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the surface as something dark and volatile began to rise. "How long?" His voice was different now, lower, sharper, edged with something that made Marco straighten instinctively. "How long has she been like this?" Marco hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "We don't know exactly. We got the call from one of the watchers 10 minutes ago. He said she collapsed suddenly. There was hesitation in reporting it." Dante's head snapped up, his gaze cutting through the dim light with a precision that felt almost violent. Hesitation. The single word carried more weight than a shouted accusation ever could. Marco exhaled slowly. The orders were unclear. They were told to observe, not intervene unless there was a direct threat. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, the kind that preceded something irreversible. Dante looked back down at Alina, at the woman he had convinced himself was better off without him, safer without his world pressing in on her from all sides. The reality in front of him told a different story. One where distance hadn't protected her, where absence had created a vulnerability he had never intended. His hand tightened slightly over hers, not enough to hurt, but enough to ground himself in something real. "Get the car ready," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're not taking her to a hospital." Marco nodded immediately. "Already arranged. Private facility. No records, no questions." Good. That was one thing he didn't have to fix. Dante slid one arm beneath Alina's shoulders, the other under her knees, lifting her with a care that felt almost at odds with the force that defined him. She weighed less than she should have. That realization settled into his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. As he stood, her head fell against his shoulder, her breath brushing faintly against his neck, warm enough to confirm she was still there, still fighting, even if her body had given out. "Stay with me," he murmured, the words so quiet they barely existed, meant more for himself than for her. "You don't get to disappear like this." He carried her to the car, every step deliberate, controlled, but beneath it all, something was unraveling, something he had kept locked away for years. The door opened before he reached it, Marco already moving, already anticipating. Dante slid into the back seat with Alina cradled against him, adjusting her carefully so her head rested against his chest, his hand instinctively finding its way back to her stomach, to the life he hadn't known existed. The door shut, sealing them inside a space that suddenly felt too small, too confined for everything pressing in on him. "Drive," he said, and the car surged forward immediately, tires gripping the asphalt as the city blurred past. Dante didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed on Alina's face, memorizing every detail, every change, every sign of what had been taken from her in his absence. His thumb brushed lightly against her wrist, searching for a pulse he could feel, something steady, something certain. It was there, faint but present. That should have been enough. It was. Because beneath the relief, beneath the urgency, something else had taken root, something far more dangerous than fear. It coiled quietly, gathering strength with every passing second, with every unanswered question, with every piece of a reality that didn't align with the one he had built in his mind. Allowed her to fall this far, to reach this point without intervention, without support, without him knowing. And Dante Morty was not a man who tolerated mistakes when it came to what was his. Looked out the window finally, the reflection staring back at him unfamiliar, darker, sharper, like something had shifted beneath the surface. "Marco," he said without breaking his gaze, "find out who was responsible for watching her." A pause. "And then find out why I wasn't told the truth." Marco didn't hesitate this time. "Yes, boss." Dante's hand tightened slightly where it rested against Alina, his voice dropping to something colder, something final. And when you do, don't bring me excuses. The car sped through the night, carrying them towards something that could no longer be controlled, no longer be undone. And for the first time since the call, Dante understood one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. The building didn't exist on any map that mattered. From the outside, it looked like an abandoned private clinic tucked behind high stone walls and wrought iron gates, the kind of place people drove past without ever really seeing. Inside, it was something else entirely. White corridors stretched under soft recessed lighting, spotless and silent, every surface controlled, every movement deliberate. The kind of place where things happen quietly, efficiently, and without record. The car barely slowed before the gates opened, as if the building itself had been waiting, anticipating his arrival. Dante didn't look at the structure as he stepped out. He only tightened his hold on Alina, adjusting her slightly in his arms as a team in white coats moved toward him with practiced urgency. Vitals, he demanded before anyone spoke. Unstable but present, the lead doctor answered quickly, already gesturing for a gurney that was unnecessary. Dante didn't release her immediately. His gaze locked onto the man's face, measuring him, weighing whether he was worth trusting in the next few minutes that would decide everything. She's been without proper nutrition for days, the doctor continued, careful but honest. Severe dehydration. We need to move now. Only then did Dante lower her, but even that was controlled, deliberate, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if letting go required more effort than he was willing to admit. As they rushed her down the corridor, he followed without hesitation, his presence bending the space around him, nurses stepping aside instinctively, doors opening before he reached them. The sound of machinery began to rise, low beeping, the steady hum of controlled life, a rhythm that felt too fragile for what lay beneath it. They transferred her to a bed in a private room, monitors attaching to her with swift precision, wires mapping out the truth her body couldn't hide anymore. Dante stood at the foot of the bed, watching as numbers flickered to life, each one a silent accusation. Her pulse was too weak, her breathing too shallow. Her skin still carried that unnatural cold that hadn't left his hand since he had touched her outside. "She's 4 months pregnant," the doctor asked, glancing briefly at him. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, without doubt. There was no room for uncertainty anymore. The timeline had already carved itself into his mind with ruthless clarity. The last night, the silence that followed, the papers that ended everything before it could begin again. The doctor nodded once, then turned his attention back to Alina. "We need to run scans immediately. Blood work, ultrasound. There are risks at this stage, especially with her condition." Dante stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "You save both," he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made the room shift, something that turned a request into a command. "Whatever it takes." No one argued. Minutes blurred into something indistinct as machines moved around her, as nurses adjusted lines and monitors, as the quiet intensity of controlled panic settled into the room. Dante didn't sit. He didn't move. He stood there like something carved from stone, watching every detail, absorbing every second, his mind working beneath the surface in a way that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with control. Marco entered silently, closing the door behind him, his presence careful, measured. "We're secure," he said under his breath. No one followed, no one saw. Dante didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words. "The Watcher?" he asked. Marco hesitated. It was subtle, but it was there. "He's being questioned." That wasn't enough. "By who?" "By me." Dante's jaw tightened, a small movement, but it carried weight. "Good. Then you already know if he's lying." Marco met his eyes for a brief second. "There's inconsistency." That word hung in the air longer than it should have. Dante looked back at Alina, at the monitors that now defined her survival, at the fragile line between what was and what could be lost. "Explain." "He claims he followed orders," Marco said carefully. "Said he was told to observe only, not to interfere unless there was a direct external threat." Dante's gaze sharpened, and this wasn't a threat. Marco exhaled slowly. "He said it wasn't classified as one." Silence settled again, heavier this time. Dante's hand moved almost unconsciously, brushing against Alina's wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. Still there, still fighting, but barely. "That's not my order," Dante said finally, his voice lower now, quieter, but carrying something far more dangerous than anger. "I don't leave what's mine unprotected." Marco didn't argue. He couldn't, because they both knew that was true. The doctor returned then, holding a tablet, his expression tight but controlled. "We've stabilized her for now," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But she's severely malnourished. Her body is under extreme stress. If we hadn't gotten her here when we did—" He stopped. He didn't need to finish. Dante's gaze didn't shift, but something behind it did. Something cold, something calculating. "The baby," he said. The doctor glanced at the screen. "Heartbeat is present, stronger than expected given the circumstances, but it's fragile. They both are." Fragile. The word didn't belong in Dante's world. He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bed, close enough to touch her, but not quite. "Fix it," he said quietly. "Whatever she needs, food, treatment, specialists. You don't stop until she's stable." "We'll do everything possible." "That's not what I said." Dante's eyes lifted, locking onto the doctor with a precision that stripped away any illusion of control. "You don't stop." The doctor nodded quickly, understood. As the room settled back into its controlled rhythm, Dante remained where he was, watching her, studying the changes, the damage, the cost of 3 months he had believed were safe. His mind moved through it all, through the orders he had given, the systems he had trusted, the people he had placed between her and the world. Somewhere in that chain something had broken, not by accident, not by oversight. Deliberately. His gaze darkened as the realization settled in fully for the first time. This wasn't neglect, it wasn't incompetence, it was interference. Someone had changed the rules. Someone had decided she didn't matter. His fingers curled slowly against the edge of the bed, the movement small, controlled, but carrying the weight of something far more dangerous than rage. Because rage was loud, predictable, temporary. What settled in him now was something else entirely. Cold, precise, permanent. "Marco," he said without looking away from Alina. "Yes, boss." "Find out who gave that order." A pause. "And when you do," Dante's voice dropped, almost a whisper, but it cut through the room with absolute clarity. "Don't bring them to me yet." Marco's brow tightened slightly. "You want confirmation first." Dante's hand finally moved, resting gently against Alina's fingers, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin, grounding himself in something real, something that still belonged to him. "I want to know how deep this goes." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, the only sound in the room that mattered, marking time in fragile increments. Dante stood there, unmoving, watching over the woman he had lost once and refused to lose again. And somewhere beneath the surface, a war had already begun. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in fragments like broken glass catching light in uneven flashes. Sound first, soft, mechanical, steady. A rhythmic beeping that felt distant, then closer, then suddenly too loud inside her head. Then came sensation. Warmth beneath her back instead of cold pavement. Fabric that was too soft, too clean, brushing against her skin. Air that didn't bite. It wrapped around her instead, controlled and quiet, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and something darker beneath it. Something familiar she couldn't place at first. Alina tried to move. Her body resisted, heavy and uncooperative as if it belonged to someone else. A low groan slipped from her throat before she could stop it, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness around her. The beeping shifted immediately, quickening, betraying what her body couldn't hide. Footsteps followed, firm, controlled, closing the distance faster than anything else in the room. "Izzy." The voice cut through everything. Low, steady, unmistakable. Her breath caught before her eyes even opened. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Her mind had played cruel tricks on her before, conjuring memories of a life she had lost, replaying moments that felt too real to be false. But this felt different. There was weight in it, presence, the kind that didn't disappear when she blinked. Her eyelids lifted slowly, reluctantly, the light forcing her to squint before shapes began to form. White ceiling, clean lines, a room she didn't recognize, and then him. Dante stood beside the bed, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there before, the way his gaze locked onto hers like he was confirming something real, something he had almost lost. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered finally, her voice raw, barely holding together. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even accusation. It was disbelief. Dante didn't move, and yet I am. The answer was simple, controlled, but something underneath it felt sharper, heavier, like it carried too much to be just words. Her gaze shifted instinctively downward. Her hand moved before she could stop it, resting against her stomach, the familiar curve grounding her in reality. It was still there, still real. She swallowed, her throat tight. "How long?" she asked quietly. "4 months." He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't doubt. Her eyes flickered back to his, something breaking through the exhaustion. "You're certain?" "I don't deal in uncertainty." Of course he didn't. That was the problem, wasn't it? Everything with him had always been clean, precise, calculated. Even their ending had followed that same pattern. No conversation, no explanation. Just a decision made without her for her, like she was something that could be removed from his life without consequence. Her lips parted, but the words came out weaker than she intended. "Then you should have known." That landed. She saw it in the slight tightening of his expression, in the way his shoulders shifted just enough to betray the control he was trying to maintain. "I should have," he admitted. 3 words. Simple, but they carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Alina let out a slow breath, her head sinking back against the pillow as the room tilted slightly. "I tried to tell you," she said, the memory clawing its way back with painful clarity. "I called your office. I went to the restaurant. I sent emails. I even waited outside your building like—" She stopped herself, shaking her head weakly. "It doesn't matter." "It matters." His voice sharpened just slightly, but enough to cut through the fog in her head. Her eyes narrowed faintly. "Does it? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you had made your decision very clear." Dante stepped closer then, the distance between them shrinking until it felt almost suffocating. "I gave orders," he said, his tone dropping, controlled but dangerous. "Specific ones. You were supposed to be taken care of, protected, provided for." A hollow sound escaped her, something close to a laugh but without humor. "Protected," she repeated, the word tasting bitter. "I've been living in a one-room apartment with broken heating and cockroaches. I've been working double shifts just to afford rent. I haven't eaten properly in days." Her hand tightened against her stomach. "That's your version of protection." Something shifted in him then. Not anger. Something worse. A realization. Sharp, immediate, violent in its clarity. "That's not what I ordered." The words came out low, almost to himself, but she heard them anyway. Alina watched him, something cold settling in her chest. "Then maybe your orders don't mean as much as you think they do." Silence followed. Heavy pressing. Dante turned slightly, his gaze moving away from her for the first time since she had opened her eyes. His hand moved, slow, deliberate, brushing over his mouth as if he was holding something back, calculating, reconstructing. Someone had changed something. Someone had interfered. And suddenly, everything that hadn't made sense did. When he looked back at her, there was no softness left, no hesitation, just clarity. "Who stopped you?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it carried weight. Alina frowned slightly, trying to focus through the haze. "A man, security, scar on his cheek. He said," she paused, her voice tightening. "He said you didn't want to see me, that if I came back again you'd file a restraining order." The air in the room went still. Dante didn't move, but something in his eyes darkened in a way that made her chest tight instinctively. "Did he?" she asked, softer now, uncertain for the first time. "Did you tell him that?" Dante's answer came without hesitation. "No." One word. Absolute. Final. And in that moment, the truth shifted between them. rearranging everything they thought they knew. Elena's breath caught, her mind struggling to catch up. Then why? Because someone wanted you cut off, Dante said, his voice dropping to something colder than she had ever heard before. Isolated, invisible. Her hand moved instinctively over her stomach again, protective, instinctive. Why? Dante's gaze followed the movement. And for the first time, something dangerous flickered beneath the surface. Because you're carrying something they can't afford to let exist. The words settled into the room slowly. Heavy, unavoidable. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a failed marriage anymore. It was about something far bigger. Something far more dangerous. And whatever had been broken between them before was nothing compared to what was coming next. The warehouse sat at the edge of the river like a forgotten secret, its rusted exterior blending into the industrial decay that kept curious eyes away. Inside, it was anything but abandoned. Light spilled harsh and white across concrete floors, cutting through shadows that clung stubbornly to corners where silence felt heavier than sound. The air carried the faint scent of oil, metal, and something darker beneath it, fear, thick and suffocating, seeping into the walls themselves. Dante stepped through the open doorway without hesitation, his presence altering the atmosphere instantly, as if the building recognized him and adjusted accordingly. Conversation stopped. Movement stilled. Every man in the room straightened instinctively, their posture tightening under the weight of his arrival. At the center of the space, tied to a metal chair bolted to the ground, sat Tommaso. His head hung low, blood dried along his jawline, his breathing uneven but conscious. He had been worked over already, but not enough to break him completely. That part was intentional. Dante didn't deal in half measures, but he also didn't rush what needed to be understood first. Marco stood a few feet away, sleeves rolled, knuckles bruised, his expression carefully neutral as he turned slightly at Dante's approach. "He's been cooperative," Marco said, though the word felt like a lie the moment it left his mouth. To a point. Dante didn't respond immediately. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood directly in front of Tommaso, looking down at him without expression. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting it press in until it became unbearable. Tommaso shifted under it, his shoulders tightening, his breathing quickening as he finally forced his head up. Their eyes met, and whatever composure Tommaso had been clinging to fractured visibly. "Boss," his voice cracked, desperation threading through it. "I can explain." Dante tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a man might study something already broken, deciding whether it was worth repairing or discarding. "Explain what?" he asked quietly. "How my ex-wife ended up starving in a neighborhood I don't even allow my enemies to walk through, or how my unborn child was left without protection under my own orders." Tommaso swallowed hard, his gaze flickering briefly toward Marco before snapping back to Dante. That wasn't how it was supposed to go," he said quickly, words tripping over each other. "The orders I got, they were different." Dante's eyes sharpened, the shift subtle but lethal. Different how? "I was told to cut her off," Tommaso said, the words spilling faster now as panic took hold. "No contact, no support beyond the initial settlement. I was told she needed to disappear from your life completely, that it was your decision, your direct instruction." A low, humorless sound escaped Dante, something that didn't reach his eyes. "And you believed that?" Tommaso hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Yes," he said, though the answer lacked conviction. "You wanted her gone, everyone knew that. The divorce, it was clean, final, it made sense." Dante stepped closer, the distance between them closing until the air itself felt suffocating. "You don't get paid to think," he said softly. "You get paid to follow my orders exactly as I give them." Tommaso's breath hitched. "I did." "No," Dante's voice cut through him, precise and final. "You followed someone else's." Silence fell again, heavier than before. Tommaso's eyes flickered, something shifting beneath the surface. Fear, yes, but also something else, calculation. The kind that made Dante's expression go colder, not warmer. "Who gave you the order?" Dante asked. Tommaso shook his head immediately, too fast. "No one. It came through the system, through the usual channels, I assumed." "You assumed wrong." The words landed like a verdict. Dante reached out then, his hand closing around Tommaso's jaw with controlled force, tilting his head back just enough to force eye contact. "You let her starve," he said, his voice still quiet, but carrying something far more dangerous than volume. "You let my child grow inside her without protection, without resources, without anything I specifically ordered you to provide." Tommaso's hand strained uselessly against his restraints. "I didn't know." "You didn't care." The correction was immediate, brutal in its simplicity. Tommaso's composure shattered then, desperation flooding his expression. "It wasn't just me," he blurted out. "There were others. Orders came from higher up. I was told not to question it, that it was above my level, that if I interfered." Dante's grip tightened just slightly, enough to make the man wince. "Higher than me?" he asked, and there was something almost curious in the way he said it, as if the concept itself amused him. Tommaso hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dante found his answer. "Who?" he repeated. Silence. Longer this time. Tommaso's eyes dropped, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had finally drained out of him. "I don't know the name," he said hoarsely. "I swear. It came through encrypted channels, routed commands, but the payment, it wasn't standard. It came from outside, from accounts tied to the Russo family." The name hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. Marco shifted slightly, his expression tightening, but Dante remained still. Perfectly still. Russo. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't coincidence. That was war. Dante released Tommaso abruptly, stepping back as if the man had already ceased to matter. His mind moved fast now, pieces aligning, patterns forming, a larger picture emerging from what had once looked like isolated failures. The altered orders, the blocked communication, the stolen funds. It wasn't about negligence. It was about isolation, weakening Alina, making her vulnerable, turning her into something that could be used. Or eliminated. His gaze darkened as the realization settled fully into place. "They didn't just want her gone," he said slowly, more to himself than anyone else. "They wanted her exposed." Marco nodded once, grim understanding settling in. If she was alone, unprotected, she was an easy target. "And the child," Dante added, his voice dropping even further. "The heir. The future. A threat before it even had the chance to exist." Tommaso looked up again, desperation creeping back into his voice. "I didn't know it would go that far," he said quickly. "I thought it was just about keeping her out of your life. I didn't know they were planning something bigger." Dante looked at him again, but this time there was nothing human left in his gaze. No anger, no emotion. Just decision. "You don't need to know," he said quietly. Tommaso froze. Because he understood. Everyone in that room did. Dante turned away, already moving toward the door, his mind no longer on the man behind him, but on what came next, on what had already been set in motion, on the fact that someone had reached into his world, had touched what was his, had tried to erase something he hadn't even known existed yet. "Boss," Marco's voice followed him carefully, "what do you want done with him?" Dante didn't stop walking. Didn't look back. "Make it known," he said, his tone calm, almost indifferent, "that this is what happens when someone interferes with my family." The door opened. Cold night air rushed in. "And Marco," Dante added, pausing just long enough for the weight of his next words to settle. "Yes, boss. This isn't over." No, it was. Because what had started as a mistake had just become a war. The hospital had been locked down so tightly, it no longer resembled a place meant for healing, but a fortress under quiet siege. Every corridor guarded, every entry point controlled, every nurse and doctor moving with the subtle awareness that they were being watched not just by security cameras, but by men who answered to a power far beyond the law. Dante stood behind the glass of the private ICU room, his reflection faint against the sterile brightness inside, his eyes fixed on the woman lying motionless beneath layers of machines that breathed, monitored, and whispered the fragile truth of her condition. Alina looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in a way that came from absence of strength, of warmth, of the quiet defiance she used to carry even when she stood beside him in rooms filled with men twice as dangerous as anyone here. Now she was still pale, caught somewhere between life and something dangerously close to slipping away. And for the first time since the call at 10 o'clock, Dante felt something unfamiliar press against his control, something sharp and unwelcome that he refused to name. The steady rhythm of the monitors was the only sound that mattered, each pulse a reminder that she was still here, still fighting even in silence, and beneath that another truth settled deeper with every passing second. The child she carried was fighting too. For months, long enough to exist, long enough to matter, long enough for someone to want it gone. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as his mind traced the chain of decisions that had led here, each one colder than the last, each one justified at the time, each one now unraveling under the weight of what had been hidden from him. He had signed the divorce papers with precision, cutting Alina out of his life, as if removing a weakness, believing distance would keep her safe from the world he controlled, from enemies who watched his every move for a single mistake. Instead, that distance had become the opening they needed. Marco approached quietly, but Dante had already registered his presence before the first step echoed across the floor. "Security is doubled," Marco said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying tension that hadn't been there before. "Outer perimeter, inner corridor, even the staff rotations. No one gets in without being cleared 3 times." Dante didn't look away from the glass. "They already got close once," he said, his voice calm, but there was something beneath it now, something colder than anger. "That means they had help." Marco didn't argue. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth was never as simple as an external enemy. The Russell family didn't operate blindly. They exploited weaknesses, and someone inside Dante's structure had given them exactly what they needed. Not just access, but information. Enough to isolate Alina, enough to erase her protection without raising alarms, enough to leave her in a place where she could be found too late. "They'll try again," Marco said carefully. Dante's eyes flickered slightly, just enough to acknowledge the inevitability of it. "No," he corrected, "they'll expect her to die here." The difference mattered, because expectation created patterns, and patterns could be broken. A sudden shift in the monitor's rhythm pulled both men's attention back to the room, the steady pulse stuttering for just a fraction of a second before stabilizing again, but it was enough. A nurse moved quickly inside, adjusting something on the IV line, her hands steady, her movements practiced, but Dante noticed what others wouldn't. The hesitation, the brief glance toward the door, the almost invisible tension in her shoulders. It lasted less than a second, but it was there. His instincts sharpened instantly. "Who is she?" Dante asked without turning. Marco's gaze followed his line of sight. "New rotation," he said. "Came in with the emergency shift, cleared through hospital administration." Dante's expression didn't change, but the air around him did. "Bring me her file." Marco nodded once and stepped back, already pulling his phone out, issuing quiet orders that would ripple through layers of men trained to act without question. Inside the room, the nurse finished her adjustments and stepped away, but Dante didn't move, didn't blink, his focus locked onto the subtle details most would ignore. The way her hands had lingered half a second too long. The way she avoided looking directly at the patient after that moment of hesitation. The way her exit path brought her slightly closer to the door than necessary. It was small, almost nothing. But in Dante's world, small mistakes were the only way truth revealed itself. Minutes passed, stretching thin with tension until Marco returned, his expression harder now, less controlled. "There's no record," he said quietly. "Not in the hospital system, not in the staffing logs. It's like she doesn't exist." Dante finally turned, slowly, deliberately, his eyes no longer calm but sharpened into something lethal. "Then she shouldn't be in my hospital," he said. Inside the room, the nurse reached the door. Her hand touched the handle. And for the briefest moment, time seemed to tighten, compressing everything into a single fragile point where instinct and reality collided. "Stop her," Dante said. The command didn't need volume. It didn't need repetition. Marco was already moving before the words fully settled, the door swinging open with controlled force as 2 guards stepped in from opposite sides, their movements precise, blocking every possible exit. The nurse froze instantly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath the surface all along, not fear of authority, but fear of failure. Her eyes flicked once toward Alina, then toward the IV line. And that was all Dante needed. "Don't touch anything," he said sharply as he moved forward, his presence filling the room with a force that shifted everything in it. The machines continued their quiet rhythm, but now every sound felt amplified, every second stretched thinner as realization settled into place. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't negligence. It was an attempt, and it had come closer than anyone realized. The nurse's lips parted as if to speak, but whatever she had planned to say died the moment Dante's gaze locked onto hers, stripping away whatever cover she thought she had. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but carrying the kind of weight that made lies feel useless before they were even spoken. Silence answered him, but her eyes didn't, because in them, just for a second, something surfaced. Recognition, not of him, but of the name she didn't dare say. And in that moment, Dante understood something far worse than a single infiltration. This wasn't just an attack on Alina. This was a coordinated move. And the hospital was already compromised. The realization did not arrive like panic. It settled like a precise calculation, cold and immediate, threading through Dante's mind with the clarity of a man who had survived too many wars to mistake instinct for fear. The hospital was no longer a sanctuary, and whatever perimeter he had believed secure had already been breached from within, which meant every corridor, every system, every uniform could no longer be trusted. He stepped deeper into the room without hesitation, his presence altering the atmosphere as if the air itself had tightened around him, and the guards responded not with confusion but with sharpened awareness, sealing the exits with a discipline that suggested they understood exactly what this moment meant. Alina remained motionless, unaware of how close danger had come, unaware of how the fragile line between her survival and her death had just been tested by hands disguised as care. The nurse tried to speak again, but the attempt collapsed under the weight of Dante's gaze, her composure fracturing in subtle ways that betrayed the training behind it. This was not an amateur. This was someone placed carefully, someone who had passed through layers of clearance not by accident but by design. Marco moved closer, his expression hardened into something that mirrored Dante's own realization, and without waiting for further instruction, he signaled for the immediate lockdown of the internal network, cutting off access points that might already be compromised. Somewhere beyond the walls of the ICU, alarms did not sound, but systems began to shift, invisible changes that would only be noticed by those who understood how power moved quietly beneath the surface. Dante's attention flicked once to the IV line, then to the monitor, then back to the nurse, mapping the sequence in reverse, reconstructing the attempt with ruthless efficiency. Whatever had been introduced into the line had not yet taken full effect, or the dosage had been interrupted, or perhaps something else had interfered with the timing. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had calculated this moment down to seconds, expecting the window between Alina's isolation and intervention to be enough. They had expected her to die without resistance, without witnesses, without consequence. They had miscalculated. "Clear the line," Dante said, his voice steady, but carrying a command that tolerated no delay. One of the guards stepped forward instantly, calling for a verified doctor, someone whose identity had been confirmed through channels Dante trusted personally, not institutionally. The nurse's breathing shifted, shallow now, controlled but no longer stable, and Dante saw it. The moment where certainty broke and fear began to creep in, not fear of him, but fear of what she had failed to accomplish. "Who gave you access?" Dante asked again, his tone unchanged, but the question was no longer an inquiry. It was a narrowing of options, a tightening of the space she occupied. Her silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was loaded, calculated, weighed against whatever loyalty or threat held her in place. That hesitation was enough to confirm what Dante already knew. This was not a lone infiltrator. This was part of something larger, something that had roots deeper than a single compromised identity. Marco returned with a tablet, his voice low but urgent. "We pulled what we could before the system locked," he said, placing it in Dante's hand. "There's a pattern. 3 other patients on this floor, same shift rotation, same falsified clearance markers, all critical, all unattended at some point in the last 2 hours. Dante's eyes moved across the data, absorbing it in seconds, and the implications unfolded instantly. This wasn't just about Alina. This was a sweep. A coordinated purge disguised as routine care, targeting individuals who, in different ways, connected back to him. Witnesses, allies, liabilities, threads in a network someone was trying to erase all at once. The hospital wasn't just compromised. It had been turned into a controlled environment for elimination. "Where are the other nurses?" Dante asked. "Gone," Marco replied. "No exit logs, no camera traces. It's like they were never here." Dante's gaze lifted slowly, settling back on the woman standing between his men, her silence now heavier, more dangerous than any confession. This wasn't just infiltration. This was precision. Someone had anticipated his moves, his resources, his response time, and had still chosen to act within his territory, within a space he controlled. That level of confidence didn't come from an external enemy alone. It came from someone who knew him. The doctor arrived moments later, breath controlled but eyes alert, immediately moving to the IV line, checking, flushing, stabilizing, undoing what had been attempted with practiced urgency. Dante didn't interfere, but he watched every movement, every adjustment, committing it to memory, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Alina's vitals steadied again, fragile but holding, and the faint shift in the monitor's rhythm told him she was still fighting, still refusing to give in, even in silence. Behind him, the nurse finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're too late," she said. Dante didn't turn immediately. He let the words settle, let them reveal what they carried beneath the surface. Too late for what? When he faced her again, his expression was no longer just controlled. It was something colder, something that had moved beyond reaction into intent. "Not yet," he said quietly. But even as he spoke, something in Marco's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of change that only came when new information arrived faster than it could be spoken. Dante didn't need to ask. He could see it. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It was still unfolding. And somewhere beyond this room, another move had already begun. The shift came not with noise, but with absence, the kind of silence that presses too heavily against the edges of a controlled environment and forces even the most disciplined minds to recognize that something has already slipped out of reach. Dante felt it before it was confirmed, before Marco's phone vibrated in his hand, before the guarded corridors outside began to subtly realign, as men received new orders that didn't match the pattern of defense but something far more dangerous: containment. The nurse's words still lingered in the air, thin but deliberate, and for the first time since he stepped into the hospital, Dante understood that this was no longer about stopping an attempt. It was about catching something already in motion. Marco stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of urgency that refused to be ignored. "We've got movement," he said, eyes flicking once toward the hallway before locking back onto Dante. "Lower level, maintenance access. One of our men found a body, uniform match, dead for at least an hour." Dante didn't react outwardly, but the calculation sharpened instantly, reassembling the timeline in his mind with ruthless precision. An hour ago meant this had begun before the nurse ever entered Alina's room, before the shift rotation, before the subtle disruption in the monitors. This wasn't a breach. This was an operation that had been running underneath them the entire time, layered so cleanly it had blended into routine until the moment it was meant to strike. His gaze drifted once more to Alina, to the fragile rhythm that still held her to life, and then away again, because whatever was happening below was now just as critical as what remained here. "Seal the upper floor," Dante said quietly, his voice steady but edged with something colder now, something that carried the authority of a man no longer reacting but taking control of the board. "No one leaves, no one enters, anyone unaccounted for." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Marco nodded once and turned, issuing orders that moved faster than sound through men trained to act without hesitation. The guards inside the room adjusted subtly, their stances tightening, their awareness expanding beyond the immediate threat to the broader structure of what was unfolding. Dante stepped back from the bed, his presence lingering for only a moment longer beside Alina, his eyes tracing the faint rise and fall of her chest, committing it to memory as if leaving something behind before stepping into the next phase of the fight. The descent into the lower levels felt different, the air heavier, colder, stripped of the controlled sterility of the upper floors, and replaced with something more mechanical, more forgotten, a place where systems ran unseen and where oversight could be manipulated without immediate detection. The lighting flickered in subtle intervals, not enough to raise alarm for most, but enough for Dante to recognize intentional interference. Someone had prepared this path. Someone had ensured that, when the time came, visibility would be just compromised enough to create hesitation. They found the body where Marco had said, sprawled near a service door that had been forced open with precision rather than brute strength, the uniform intact, the identification still in place, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was the method: clean, silent, efficient. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The man had been taken out before he even realized he was in danger. Dante crouched slightly, his eyes scanning the surroundings, reading the scene not for what it showed but for what it implied. The door led into a maintenance corridor that branched into multiple access points: electrical systems, oxygen lines, backup generators, all critical infrastructure that could cripple the hospital without ever touching the patients directly. This wasn't just about Alina anymore. This was leverage. "They're not here to finish her," Dante said, his voice low almost to himself, but Marco heard it clearly. "They're here to make you choose," Marco replied. Dante's eyes lifted slowly, the realization settling deeper now, sharper, more dangerous. Alina upstairs, fragile, targeted, barely holding on. The hospital infrastructure below, vulnerable, capable of turning every life inside into collateral within minutes. And somewhere in between, an enemy who had orchestrated both, forcing him into a position where protecting one could cost the other. A faint sound echoed from deeper within the corridor, almost lost beneath the hum of the building's systems, but Dante caught it instantly. Not movement, not footsteps. A timer. His expression didn't change, but the air around him did, tightening with the sudden awareness that this was no longer a hunt. It was a race. "Find it," he said sharply. Men moved instantly, splitting into calculated paths, tracing the sound through branching corridors that seemed designed to confuse, to delay, to misdirect. Dante followed the echo himself, his pace controlled but urgent, his mind already mapping the possibilities of what had been planted and where it would cause the most damage. Oxygen lines, power grids, fire suppression systems. Any one of them could turn the hospital into a trap. The sound grew louder, clearer, until it led them to a sealed panel, slightly ajar, just enough to reveal what lay behind it. Marco reached it first, pulling it open fully, and for a brief moment everything stilled. Because inside wasn't a bomb. It was worse. A compact device wired directly into the hospital's life support control system, its screen glowing faintly with lines of code that pulsed in sync with the building's core operations, not counting down to an explosion, but executing something far more precise, far more devastating. Dante stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he read what most wouldn't understand in time. It wasn't designed to destroy the hospital. It was designed to shut it down. Gradually, system by system, patient by patient, starting with the ICU, starting with Alina. And as the realization settled into place, the final piece clicked with brutal clarity. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. And whoever had sent it was watching to see which life Dante would try to save first. The truth did not arrive as a revelation, but as a tightening of inevitability, the kind that leaves no space for hesitation once it settles into place. And Dante understood in that silent, electric moment that the game had never been about destruction, but about exposure, about forcing him into a position where every decision would reveal something he had spent years burying beneath control, beneath calculation, beneath the illusion that he could separate power from consequence. The device pulsed softly inside the panel, its quiet operation far more dangerous than any explosive force, and the coded sequences running across its surface reflected a mind that understood systems not as machines, but as living networks, fragile, interdependent, and devastating when manipulated with precision. Whoever had built this did not want chaos. They wanted suffering measured in seconds, in breaths, in the slow collapse of life support that would begin in the ICU and ripple outward, leaving Dante with enough time to understand exactly what he was losing and why. Marco's voice cut through the stillness, controlled but edged with something darker now. We can shut it down manually, he said, though the uncertainty beneath the words betrayed the risk. But if we're wrong, it could trigger a fail-safe, full system crash, no backup. Dante didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the device, absorbing every detail, every line of code, every subtle irregularity that hinted at intention rather than randomness. And beneath that analysis, something else began to surface, something that had been building since the moment he heard Marco's voice at 10 o'clock, something that no longer allowed him the distance he had once maintained so effortlessly. This was not just an attack on his empire, not just a strategic move by a rival family testing his defenses. This was personal, constructed with an understanding of his patterns, his weaknesses, his history. The nurse's hesitation, the falsified identities, the timing of Alina's isolation, the pregnancy he had not known about. Each piece aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. They want you to hesitate, Marco added, quieter now. They want you to choose wrong. Dante's eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the truth of it, but the hesitation they expected never came. Instead, something else replaced it, something colder and far more dangerous than doubt. No, he said, his voice low, steady, absolute. They want me to react. The distinction mattered, because reaction could be predicted, but intention could not. He reached forward not to touch the device, but to trace the wiring path with his eyes, following its connection deeper into the system, mapping its reach, its influence, its limitations. This wasn't built to be unstoppable. It was built to create the illusion of inevitability, to pressure him into a decision before he had time to see beyond the surface. And beneath that illusion, there was always a flaw. There had to be. Cut external access, Dante said suddenly. Marco frowned slightly. What? They're watching through the system, Dante continued, his focus sharpening. If we shut it down completely, we lose control. But if we isolate it, he paused, the final piece clicking into place, we turn it into a closed loop. Marco understood instantly, his expression shifting as the strategy unfolded. They lose visibility. And control, Dante finished. Orders moved fast after that, faster than the silent countdown embedded in the system, men rerouting connections, isolating networks, severing the pathways that allowed the device to communicate beyond itself. The building seemed to hold its breath as layers of infrastructure shifted, the invisible threads connecting systems tightening, rerouting, locking into place. The device continued its sequence, unaware that its reach was shrinking, that its influence was being contained. Upstairs in the ICU, Alina's monitors flickered once, then stabilized again, the fragile rhythm of her life no longer tied to the external manipulation that had nearly ended it. Dante felt it without seeing it, the subtle shift in the system reflecting the change below, and for the first time since the call, something inside him eased, not relief, not yet, but the absence of immediate loss. Now, Marco said, his voice quieter, more controlled, we can shut it down. Dante nodded once. The final command was executed with precision, the device's sequence collapsing in on itself as its connections were severed, its code dissolving into inert data that no longer held power over anything beyond its own casing. The silence that followed was different this time, not heavy, not oppressive, but clear, sharp, filled with the aftermath of something that had come dangerously close to succeeding. But Dante did not move away, because something still wasn't right. His gaze lingered on the device, not on its failure, but on its design, on the intention behind it, and then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the secured channel that very few had access to. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to, because the message waiting there had already arrived. A single line. No sender identification. No encryption trace. Just words. She was never the target. For a moment the world narrowed to that sentence, everything else falling away as the true shape of the attack revealed itself with devastating clarity. Alina, the pregnancy, the hospital, the device, none of it had been the objective. It had been a distraction. A perfectly constructed one. Dante's expression didn't change, but something far deeper shifted beneath the surface, something that moved beyond control into something far more dangerous. Because if Alina wasn't the target, then someone else was. And in that moment, As his mind raced through the possibilities, through the connections he had overlooked, through the single vulnerability he had left exposed without realizing it, the final realization struck with brutal precision. The attack hadn't been meant to take his past. It had been meant to draw him away from his future. Dante turned sharply, already moving, his voice cutting through the corridor with a force that left no room for delay. "Get me back upstairs," he said, but his focus was no longer on Alina alone. Because somewhere beyond this hospital, beyond the walls he had secured, beyond the systems he had just saved, the real target was already within reach. And this time, he might already be too late.